Today we'll look into post-structuralism and deconstruction, the last part. Well, there will be another section just on all the terminologies of structuralism and post-structuralism, including those that of Saussure and then of Derrida and Barthes and maybe a little bit on Foucault. No, not Foucault. So just a brief recap. And today our main focus would be on one practical example of deconstructing a poem, The Castaway, written by William Cowper. So before we move on to that, just a brief recap. So we saw some basic differences between structuralism and post-structuralism, and we tried to figure out where it originated, how it originated, and we got to understand that we've been thrust into a decentered universe which has created a certain anxiety about language, which we tend to betray in most of our daily conversation and interaction. Then we saw some basic differences in terms of origin, tone and style, attitude to language, and aim of structuralists and post-structuralists. Then moving on to Barthes, we saw how he seemed to have transferred his loyalties from the structuralist to the post-structuralist side, and the reasoning behind it gives us a fair idea of the two movements themselves, in and of themselves. Okay, so through his three books, The Structural Analysis of Narrative, The Pleasure of the Text, and The Death of the Author, we find that the determined quality of any text is merely an illusion, right? And we also see that the text itself has become independent and free in the process, thereby giving us all kinds of opportunities to go wild with it. Then we see Barbara Johnson curving this wildness a bit and bringing in certain discipline, at least showing that it is not as hedonistic as it originally seemed to be, that it is merely a process of discipline, identification, and dismantling the sources of the textual power. Then we saw Jacques Derrida, and with Derrida's structure, sign, and play, now we saw how a certain intellectual event has taken place which had transformed completely the way we perceived the world. So some elemental factors contributing to this intellectual event were a couple of wars and holocausts and all this. I should not be uttering these words with such levity, but it's not levity that has brought in this tone in me. It's merely that we've already discussed it so many times. I just seem to be skimming through them rather than giving them the kind of importance or the seriousness they deserve. So forgive me if anyone is offended by my tone here. So a couple of scientific discoveries and a few intellectual and artistic revolutions. So we see that a certain liberated, text or liberated system is made available to us, which we do not know how to make use of, and our reliance on the system is unnerving, to say the least. But then Nietzsche, he asks us not to shy away, not to turn away from them, and asks us to revel in this ambiguous state of being, where there are no facts but only interpretations. Then we see Derrida's writing, all of his writings, just some speech and phenomena of grammatology, writing indifference. We'll be dealing with speech and difference later on, writing indifference later on. As I said, we'll be dealing with some of his core concepts, which I have not included in any of the videos I've posted so far on post-structuralism or deconstruction. So that would be a separate one, because mainly it included the terms, the transformation of terms from Saussure to Derrida, and it will focus on that mainly. Anyway, so there is this idea that fragmented, self-divided, and centralist birth has taken place, and which seems to stand in and of by itself. So there is nothing outside the text. One central axiom of deconstruction, which has been variously misconstrued, is taken up for study, and we move to the source to realize that language itself is a is a preformed system, a ready-made system, which we can only make use of in certain sense rather than uh, you know uh, mm, master it in any way. So we see that even though the writer writes in a language in a and in a logic whose proper systems laws, and uh, he cannot dominate it absolutely. So we cannot master the language. We can only make use of some parts of it. And speaking of reading and interpretation, we come to realize through Peter Barry's understanding that Derrida called the kind of interpretation we do, that is reproducing the text, doubling commentary. Okay, and he tells us not to reproduce but produce the text, because there is nothing behind us for us to reconstruct. And that's how we end up with the idea that there is nothing outside the text. So you interpret in the sense that you produce the text. That is, a critical reading would help you produce the text rather than reproduce the text. Then yeah, I've just mentioned a couple of terms here. Earlier it was merely deconstruction, aporia and logocentrism. I've added differentia, lang and parole. And no, yeah, difference is, it's not a misspelt word. It is an actual difference. We'll talk about it in our next video, inshallah. That maybe so yeah, we spoke about deconstruction, that how Derrida believed that everything, it was just a way of thinking for him, which he believes would help us dismantle everything we perceived as absolutes, right? So all the absolutes, all the privileged factors were to be deconstructed, and this would lead us to a state of aporia, a state of impasse, because ultimately we are left with no sides to take, and we are left with plenty of questions and very few answers. And this state of being is not vulnerability, or it's not a vulnerable state to be, or it's not a weak state to be. We are told that being in this state is fine, it's absolutely fine, and is a mark of maturity. And then we saw a little bit about logocentrism, as in how reason or logic is, or the word is made the center of everything. But then it is also a reaction against phonocentrism, wherein the speech sounds were privileged over the written word. Speech was privileged over the written word, and here the logos is made the center of all understanding, right? So Derrida expects us to, while in difference, what we see is a deference, a deferral and difference both working together to make meaning impossible, make absolute meaning impossible. I mean, that is the most simplistic form of definition I could give you right now. It would really take quite a bit of time for me to work on difference. And then Lang and Parole, we've already seen Lang and Parole, so we'll move on to the next slide. In postalism, we saw a few of the practical differences and how they seem to, work towards uncovering the unconscious dimensions of the text. Then we saw some of the definitions given by J.A. Curran, Jacques Derrida, and Barbara Johnson. Then we saw major differences highlighted in this table as to how the structuralists look for uniformity, whereas the post-structuralists look for some deformity, some crack, some fissure somewhere, some contradiction within the text, with the aim to show textual disunity. Then we saw what the post-structuralist critics do. Basically, the main idea is to read the text against itself, to expose the textual subconscious. Because see, the first step, any time you pick up a book and do a deconstructionist or post-structuralist reading of the text, you would go for the textual subconscious. You would try to figure out what the surface meaning is, and then move into the to its subconscious, and you would try to fix upon the surface feature of the words. Okay, first of all, you read against the grain, and then how do you read against the grain? You would read at certain words, fix yourself to some word, particular word, and fix that attention in the sense that you try to use it as a key to unlock the whole text. So what happens is the text seems to just dismantle all by itself. Then you show that the text is characterized by disunity rather than unity, and instead of single passage, instead of looking at the whole text in its entirety, you look at one single passage and work on it to reveal multiplicities of meaning. Then, yes, shifts and breaks. You look for fault lines in any text, which is hidden, not too obvious. Then we worked out an example deconstruction, an example of Dylan Thomas poetry on three levels, on three stages: verbal, textual, and linguistic. Now today we are going to look at this the second example, The Castaway, written by William Cowper. So before we proceed, it would be better for us to just go through this once. In the verbal stage, we look to the conventional forms of close reading. I mean, this is a conventional form of close reading, and we look for paradoxes and contradictions at the verbal level. In the textual level, what we do is we move beyond phrases to take an overall view of the poem. Okay? On the linguistic level, we look for moments in the poem when the adequacy of language itself as a medium of communication is called into question. Okay? Example, when implicit references are made to the unreliability or untouched trustworthiness of language. So what we found in our previous example is that the text revealed itself to be fractured, contradictory, and symptomatic of a cultural and linguistic malaise. And it aimed to show disunity and make all poems look alike. Generally, it is a general affliction of deconstruction, or any theory for that matter, whatever theory you apply to a text, it tends to take away the individuality of the text. So, yes, your enjoyment may be called into question because of this process. Anyway, let's see today's text. Obscurest night involved the sky, the Atlantic billows roared, when such a distant wretch as I washed headlong from on board, of friends, of hope, of all bereft, his floating home forever left. No braver chief could Albion boast than he with whom he went, nor ever ship left Albion's coast with warmer wishes sent. He loved them both, but both in vain, nor him beheld, nor her again. Not long beneath the whelming brine, expert to swim he lay, nor soon he felt his strength decline, or courage die away, but waged with death a lasting strife, supported by despair of life. He shouted, nor his friends had failed to check the vessel's course, but so the furious blast prevailed that pitiless perforce they left their outcast mate behind and scudded still before the wind. Some succor yet they could afford, and such as storms allow. The cask, the coop, the floated cord, they laid not to bestow. But he they knew nor ship nor shore, whatever they gave should visit more. Nor cruel as it seemed could he their haste himself condemn, aware that flight in such a sea alone could rescue them. yet bitter felt it still to die, deserted, and his friends so nigh. He long survives who lives an hour in ocean self upheld, and so long he, with unspent power, his destiny repelled. And ever, as the minutes flew, entreated help or cried adieu, at length his transient respite past, his comrades who before had heard his voice in every blast could catch the sound no more. For then, by toil subdued, he drank the stifling wave, and then he sank. No poet wept him, but the page of narrative sincere that tells his name, his worth, his age, is wet with anson's tear. And tears by bards or heroes shed alike immortalize the dead. I therefore purpose not a dream descanting on his fate, to give the melancholy theme a more enduring date. But misery still delights to trace the semblance in another's case. No voice divine the storm allayed, no light propitious shone, when snatched from all effectual aid, we perished, each alone. But I beneath a rougher sea, and whelmed in deeper gulfs than he. Now, speaking of what the poem says, it is fairly simple. It's extremely simple poem because see, Cowper, despite all his classical education, he never went in for high flown allusions or rhetorical flourishes. It's always simple, straightforward, easy to understand, heart to heart English. So it is fairly simple, and I believe you understood from this that on the surface, the poem speaks about this one particular sailor who died at sea, right? Who was washed overboard and and died by drowning in the sea, and how he seems to be like it's a very Titanic situation where he sees the ship moving away, where he sees all his comrades moving away from him, but he cannot do anything about it. Neither his comrades can do anything about it because it's a stormy space. The whole sea is engulfed in storm, and they can do nothing but row away and but move away. So on the surface, yeah, on the surface, it's the death of a person washed overboard from a ship and who speaks in his own voice and laments his fate. Underlying interpretation is that Cowper's own fear. Cowper's own fear of an isolation within his incipient mental breakdown. If you know anything of his autobiography, what you would his biography, what you would know is that Cowper lived for a while, around 70 years, I think, and during which time he was mostly content with his own life. But there were times when he had a mental breakdown, when he was totally aimless, did not know what to do with himself, and tried to commit suicide a couple of times, and was at one point, admitted to a mental asylum as well. But then he once again found some faith and got back on his feet and continued writing poetry, writing poetry from his heart. So it's a very touching poem. This seems to just speak out to you from heart to heart. Now, what you see is the deconstructionist approach. I mean, this is the general attitude. This is the general way of looking at, looking at and interpreting any work. You see the surface meaning, and then you look at the underlying meaning. Sometimes applying the biography of the author to it. Now, the deconstructionist, what he does is he totally foregoes both levels, both attitudes, both the surface meaning and the underlying meaning, and he goes for the kill directly. So what he sees, what the deconstructionist sees, is what the poem claims to say and what it ends up saying. Okay, what the feelings professed are and what the feelings that are expressed. Professed as in, see, we find mm, where's that? See, this line. Nor, cruel as it seemed, could he their haste himself condemn. Away that flight in such a sea alone could rescue them. Yet bitter felt it still to die, deserted and in friends so nigh. See, he seems to claim that he is not really sorry about his friends leaving him behind, but at the same time, he is, he professes that he is not sorry. He professes that um, he's not going to blame his shipmates for his plight. But even saying so, yeah. But even saying so, Siddhika says he does not blame his shipmates for his plight. But even saying this raises the possibility that he does. Okay. So the reconstructionist first looks at what it is, what it professes, and what is expressed, and then you also look at the text itself, how there is a break or a transition from in terms of tense, gender, pronoun, or time or pace, all of these, right? So sometimes in this text you may see there are three pronouns variously used. At one point he uses the pronoun says, I therefore purpose not a dream descanting on his fate. So, whose fate are we talking about here? And who is the I? There is an aporia existing which we cannot seem to answer. We are at an impasse here. All right. And then see, there is another place where the pronoun we perished each alone. And why is the we? Who are the we that perished? And how could we be alone? When we say we, it has to be a plural pronoun, right? So when we say we, there must be more than one person drowning and dying. But then what we are talking about is this one single person who drowned, right? So see, and also we if it is say for instance if it's a generalized notion of how everyone has to face death, it would mean we perish, not perished. So it is a very specific tense. It is used in the past tense, right? It is very specific as to when this perishing took place. So, which would imply that we are talking about one particular person who perished or a multiple of people. But then we also know from the beginning there has been only one person who is drowning, and the rest of them are in the ship going away, leaving him, right? So, see, the deconstructionists would look at all of these, little parts that seem to just, we tend to ignore while giving it on reading, while reading them, and try to decipher what exactly, I mean, there is no deciphering possible, okay? There is no deciphering possible, only disentanglement, but even allowing for disentanglement, or, or this poem or any poem for that matter cannot be completely disentangled. You may know that there is a knot in each place, but undoing the knot would not be your headache. That would not be your problem. Um, so you see, the text sometimes uses I or he, but of course we as well. Now, specific details take away from generalized sense of loss, abandonment, and isolation. Why we have given here this is that, see, uh, as I said, on the surface, it means that this poem relates to this one particular incident that happened. Mm, I mean, and that is narrated in um, one of the books written by George Anson, A Voyage Round the World, and it's a collection of notes or memoir from his voyages. Okay, and it relates to the death of a sailor by drowning, and it's this Cowper seems to have come across this narration at some point, and it seems to have stuck to his memory, and later on he has put them into this one very beautiful poem. So, though on the surface it's a simple story based on a narrative presented in someone's memoir, it still seems as the, Cowper's, the poet's own fear of isolation, fear of of loss or like fear, abandonment, and isolation. But then, when these words, specific words, are used, what happens is it takes away from the generalization of the feelings, right? At least Peter Barry believes that using specific terms, using specific words or images could actually steal away from the generalized sense of loss, abandonment, isolation. Then you look for linguistic quirks, as we've already spoken about it. See, linguistic quirks are basically, linguistic oddities. Linguistic oddity isn't something that stands out, that's something that's interesting and may not completely make sense to the context in which it is existing. Okay, so there are many of these in Castaway. So in the final stanza, the poet says, "See, yeah, the poet says, we perished each alone. We perished each alone." The poem has shown the death of only one person. On the other hand, if the statement is a general one about how we all have to face death alone, then we should expect the present tense rather than the past. So this itself is a beautiful example of a linguistic quirk, because neither the pronoun nor the tense, the pronoun and the tense do not match at all to the context. Okay, it may match, but out of context, yes, it does. But to the context, it does not. So it is a linguistic oddity. So these linguistic oddities undermine secure meanings, the, as in the inconsistent pronoun with the tense required. Again, we end up with an aporia. As we have already spoken, aporia is nothing but an impasse or a knot in the text, a puzzle. So this is something very similar to what Emerson devised earlier in the beginning of the 20th century, the seven types of ambiguity. So this is the seventh ambiguity he speaks of, which occur when there is an irreconcilable conflict of meaning within the text, when the text itself seems to does not agree with itself. Okay, so that's the kind of ambiguity we end up with, which is now called aporia. So Barth's death of the author in the text, everything must be disentangled, nothing deciphered. That's the Barth's idea proposed by Barth in the death of the author. But what we understand is that the text could neither be deciphered nor could it be disentangled. You know there is a tangle, but disentangling is a task better left alone because you cannot do it. Because according to deconstructionists, the text is always working against itself. Hence, there is bound to be a tangle all the time. So Aporia resists disentanglement. Most of the contradictions, paradoxes, and shifts are all at an impasse. So whatever contradictions or paradoxes or shifts we have seen so far, they are all at an impasse here. So look at this line: "No poet wept for him, but the page of narrative sincere." See, when we say no poet wept for him, there isn't actually an actual poetry written for him, right? So the text seems to be acting against itself. There is an entanglement here that you cannot disentangle. There is an aporia here. I mean, there is a difference that exists that cannot be breached. See, but the page of narrative sincere would be the page in Anson's diary, or whatever work he had in, the story was written in. Except for that page, there is nothing else to there is no poetry for this sailor, it seems. But then there is an actual poetry, so the text is always working against itself. That's all I wanted to say. The text itself contradicts its claims. Anyway, this is all for today. Thank you for your patience listening, and we'll continue with the terminologies belonging to both Saussure and Derrida, inshallah, tomorrow. Thank you. Stay safe. Assalamu alaikum.